All right. We're just giving a few minutes to get everybody in and settled.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session. We're here today to talk about trauma, secondary trauma, and self-care. My name is Jessica. I use they, them pronouns on my name. I'm a training and technical assistance specialist at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've been with the coalition for over 4 years, and I have been in the movement since 2009, and I worked at 3 of our programs before coming here, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation with folks doing this type of work. And I'm here with my awesome co-presenter, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Cooper. I'm the Technical Assistance and Education Manager for the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I have been with the coalition for a little over 3 years, and was that program before that as a medical and human trafficking advocate, and am also very excited to be able to talk about this topic with everyone today, and just be able to hopefully give everyone some useful and helpful information about trauma, secondary trauma, and self-care. Before we start, we always like to talk about your needs as participants today. You'll probably hear this a lot. Hopefully, we'll hear this a lot. But we're going to be talking about trauma. So as usual, please take care of yourself during the presentation. Please make sure that if you need to take a break, if you need to step away, obviously you're more than welcome to do that. And if there's anything that comes up during the course of the training, please, debrief with someone, and we'll have our contact information at the end as well. You're always welcome to reach out to us. But one way or another, take care of your needs today, and make sure that all of your self-care, which we will be talking a lot about in our presentation, is at the forefront of your time today and throughout the rest of the conference. The one thing that we always like to start with is suggestions to maintain your balance through self-awareness, connecting to the importance of our experiences as we engage in this information. It's important to check in. It's important to check in with yourself to see where you're at today, and to know that when we talk about things like trauma, secondary trauma, some things may come up for you. And if you feel resistance, if you are feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling unsure about that information, this is a good opportunity to engage in self-awareness practice as a way to engage in trauma-informed and survivor-centered practices. So if there are things that come up that challenge you, if like Jessa and I, when you hear the word self-care, you immediately start to roll your eyes uncontrollably, we get it. But we encourage you to use that as a starting off point, and to approach this material with what we like to refer to as beginner mind. We've all been through presentations about trauma, about self-care. All of these things are not new concepts to us, more than likely. And we may have some resistance, especially if these are topics that have been brought up in ways that made us feel uncomfortable in the past. But hopefully we will not make you feel too uncomfortable today and have useful information. So we ask that you, be here with your whole self and use this as an opportunity to cultivate self-awareness through journaling, debriefing, whatever works best for you. What we know is that when we cultivate self-awareness, we have a practice of self-reflection that allows us to pay attention to what really helps us to stay balanced, caring, and effective as advocates. The other thing that we ask that you bring to the table is a willingness to do the self-work. So, we're going to be talking about a lot of concepts today. Some may be familiar, some may be new. But just be willing to engage in the self-awareness process, the process of self-reflection, checking in if you're resistant to concepts or if something feels unfamiliar or uncomfortable, and knowing that by maintaining that attention and having that willingness to do that self-work, it is an opportunity to help you create that balance, that self-balance that really helps you to be the advocate that we know we all would like to be. All right, so as we talked about, we're going to be talking about trauma, which, for all of you is probably not a foreign concept. But we like this graphic because it really demonstrates the fact that when we talk about trauma, we're not talking about one thing. Trauma, is all of these things that come up for us. Whether it's the forms of trauma that we work with on a day-to-day basis as direct service providers, things like sexual violence, domestic violence, human trafficking. But then there's also, medical interventions. The dentist is super traumatizing for me because I've had some pretty horrible experiences there. There's also generational trauma. There's cultural, historical trauma that can come up for folks. As well as, the kind of trauma that happens when there's an accident or a natural disaster or, I don't know, a worldwide pandemic that we've been living through for almost 2 years now. So when we say this word trauma, it can mean so many different things and can mean so many different things to each individual, as well as how we experience that trauma. So we're going to be really digging into this in a lot more detail today. But to start out with, we like to point out that we all have a concept of what trauma is. We've all experienced various levels of trauma and various kinds of trauma. And, there's more than one kind, and it impacts people in all sorts of different ways, which we're going to talk about more today. So when we say this word trauma, right? The word describes a unique and individual experience. So as we talked about before, this is going to look different for everyone, even those of us that are living through this global pandemic. We're all having a different experience of it. So we have the same thing, the same, trauma, but each of us experience it in a completely unique and individual way. Trauma is an emotionally and distressing experience or experiences. Events, circumstances, and they're often life-changing. They're an experience or event that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And we're going to get into the details of why that happens, within the brain. But the reality is that trauma really does overwhelm us and makes it difficult for us to cope with what's happening. A person is left feeling powerless within the circumstances of their lives, and the experience or event is considered outside the realm of normal human experiences. So it has a profound effect on an individual's psychological development or well-being, and often involves a physiological, social, and or spiritual impact. So because each person is unique and has a different set of coping skills, support networks, and a host of other factors that every individual will experience, different levels of trauma, different reactions. Some may have similar trauma symptoms, but have experienced completely different forms of trauma. So it may also be an outcome of a cultural or historical trauma, which can then impact communities across generations. So when we think about trauma, it's important for us to remember, as we see on the screen here, it's unique to every individual. It's an emotional and distressing event that disrupts an individual's ability to cope. And it's something that is going to look different for each and every person, even if the kind of trauma that they're experiencing is the same. So there's 3 important concepts around trauma and the brain that begin to create a framework for understanding its impact. So, for example, a child's brain grows in relation to their experiences. So it's not just the negative aspects resulting from, let's say, witnessing domestic violence in the home, but the brain also grows as a result of positive experiences. So for example, if they go into a domestic violence shelter with their parents and it proves to be a positive experience, or their interactions with advocates result in positive experiences for that child. So the nature and quality of these negative and positive experiences help to shape a child's development. Each child's experience is unique to them, as we've talked about before. So the take-home point here is that experiences play a major role in shaping a child's brain. Those experiences that are consistently stimulated, positive or negative, strengthen brain growth and brain pathways. Genes and experiences work together, but play very different roles. So, simply, genes provide the basic wiring, but experiences fine-tune the brain's architecture. So both of these things, when we talk about that nature versus nurture, what we know is that it's really a combination of both. It's nature and nurture that help us to develop, and our brains to develop. And that brain development leads to, once again, how we perceive, how we cope with, and how we manage stressful situations and trauma. Now, the impact of, experiences on brain development, requires stimulation. So experience stimulates certain brain pathways. Those consistently stimulated are strengthened. Think about when you're walking through your lawn, you have a shortcut that you like to take. If you take that shortcut enough, there's going to be a pathway there. There's not going to be green grass. There's going to be a pathway that shows that's the way that you take all the time. Same thing goes with those experiences and neural pathways that get strengthened with stimulation. Genes and experience work together, and once again, they play very different roles. So the genes are creating that basic wiring plan of, hey, I'm the type of person that likes to take a shortcut through the neighbor's yard. Whereas the experience fine-tunes that architecture to say, I like taking the shortcut through the neighbor's yard, and now I can notice that there's a pathway there, and I hope I don't get in trouble for it. So when we talk about the context of attachment and stress and trauma, there's different kinds of stress, right? There's different ways that, our early attachment relationships influence our ability to handle stress and trauma, and how they buffer us from potentially harmful effects. So for children, once again, some types of stress can promote growth, others can be harmful to the developing brain, and the differences depend on the intensity and the duration of the stressful experience. Differences among children in their bodies, stress reactions, and the extent to which supportive adult is available to help the child cope with adversity. So these differences can be understood within the context of three basic types of stress experiences that lead to different outcomes. Understanding the impact of stress and trauma on children also helps us to understand the impact on adults who may have experienced abuse in childhood and later are experiencing, other forms of violence like interpersonal violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, etc. as adults. So when we talk about positive stress, it refers to the types of stress that are part of everyday life. Meeting new people, dealing with frustration, like when you're doing an online conference and none of your tech seems to work properly, right? That's experienced within the safety of warm, nurturing relationships. Positive stress is a really important and necessary aspect of healthy development. And as children, when our caregivers respond to us in protective, calming, and reassuring ways, we take in those experiences and build on them to develop our own internal capacity to manage stress ourselves. Tolerable stress refers to the kind of stress that's associated with events that are more upsetting and more challenging, but are still manageable with support. So tolerable stress includes things that are disturbing enough to generate a stress response that's significant or long-lasting enough to potentially alter the brain's architecture. So, they're not really relieved by supportive relationships that facilitate adaptive coping and restore the stress response system. But they're there for a reason, right? we can mitigate that with ongoing supportive relationships. So what we're talking about here is things like being in the hospital, the death of a family member, or even as a child, the death of a family pet, or being part of a disaster. They're tolerable stress situations, but when we have people in our lives that we can turn to for protection or can help us recover from that frightening or upsetting experience, that can strengthen our own capacity to manage, more stressful situations as we go through. And then there's traumatic or toxic stress, which is associated with strong and prolonged activation of the body's stress response systems in the absence of the buffering protection of, in this case, adult support. So types of stressors include recurrent child abuse or neglect, severe maternal depression, parent substance abuse, or violence within the home. And when our stress response system is activated for long periods of time, it causes changes in our bodies and in our brains. Although responses vary, these reactions can affect learning and memory, as well as our health and well-being over time. Again, the presence of supportive relationships, both in childhood and as adults, help us to recover from these effects. So what's most important is that it's not just the nature of the stressor that makes a difference, it's the ability of the parent, caregiver, to help the child manage stress, to not feel abandoned or blamed, and to use that to strengthen their own abilities to manage stressful situations in the future. And now, to really articulate this, I'm going to hand things over to Jessa to talk a little bit more about how those childhood experiences can impact the lifespan.
All right. I love talking about ACEs. I'm an ACEs nerd, so hopefully I have some other fellow ACE nerds along for this ride together. For folks that are not familiar, the ACEs study is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This is one of the largest investigations that was ever conducted on the links between childhood maltreatment and later life health and well-being. It initially started out to measure like adulthood diabetes, but what they actually uncovered was much deeper than that and really informed a lot of work around trauma and childhood development. So I'm really excited to talk through this. So what you see on your screen is a pyramid, the ACE pyramid. And what this does, it represents the conceptual framework for the study. There are some gaps depicted as the two arrows that link the adverse childhood experience to the risk factors that lead to health and social consequences the higher you go up the pyramid, right? So again, this study took place to essentially, it uncovered traumatic or stressful life events that were experienced between the age of birth and 18. So through childhood, right? The original study was conducted by Kaiser, and it was conducted on primarily white, upper to upper middle class, and highly educated. And by highly educated, I'm talking about paper education, right? Like higher degree folks. Which is fine, right? It's fine, but given the prevalence of this study and how important it is to the conversation, again, around trauma and development throughout the lifespan, in 2012, the Institute for Safe Families in Philadelphia were like, hey, this isn't reflective of the whole community, right? The way we're using it isn't reflecting what's actually going on, right? It's a good starter of the conversation, but there's more. So they conducted the Philadelphia Urban ACE study. And this study not only showed higher rates of ACEs, because in the original study, an average score was like 1. Like you could walk out of your ACE score with 0. There were participants that tested 0. The Philadelphia Urban ACE study found the average score of somebody aged 18 is 4. And we're going to talk about what that means. So not only did they find there's higher rates of ACEs that folks are experiencing, but it also examines stressors that exist in communities that people live in, right? Because that's also important and impacts your development and your experiences, right? So this examined things like racial discrimination, safety in neighborhoods, and trust of neighbors. Ultimately, what the Philadelphia Urban ACE study suggests is the need for services that address unique environmental stressors that are experienced to mitigate their impact on individuals to ultimately prevent ACEs. So in the original study, again, this was conducted in 1998, there were more than 17,000 folks that underwent this comprehensive physical examination and chose to provide detailed information about their adverse childhood experiences, or their ACEs, related to the 10 original ACEs, which are abuse, which are emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse, household challenges, which are intimate partner violence, substance use in the household, mental illness, separation, divorce, or an incarcerated household member, and then neglect, so emotional and physical. Again, Philadelphia expanded this out, right? Thinking largely, and that's how PCADV approaches our prevention work, is looking in the community, right? The environmental factors that contribute to risk factors and long-term health. So what Philadelphia added was neighborhood safety and trust, bullying, witnessing violence, experiences with racism, and foster care. And what happens is essentially, if you experience one of those categories, right, the original 10 or the addition with Philly ACEs, you get a 1, right? For every experience you had to get a 1. And again, your ACE score will increase as you have these more experiences you have, the higher score you have, which also raises the risk for negative health outcomes. Again, in the original study, around 70% experienced at least 1%, experienced at least one trauma, so had a score of 1. Again, Philadelphia found the average score of 4. So as you can see on the sliding scale, that placed you already at age 18 at a high risk, right? Because you don't age out of your trauma experiences. Wouldn't that be amazing if we started new at age 18, left all our trauma behind? Incredible, but that's not how it works. So what happens, what this can look like with an ACE score of 4 or more, is, having 4 times the risk of emphysema or chronic bronchitis development as an adult, over 4 times the likelihood of depression, and 12 times the risk of suicidality as an adult. ACE scores were directly related with early initiation of things like smoking and sexual activity, pregnancy and adolescence, and risk for intimate partner violence. This is also really important to think about when we think about how identity also plays into these experiences, right? For example, like the LGBTQ plus community, queer youth have a really high rate of suicidality, right? And they're also at a really high risk for things like bullying and sexual and physical violence due to their identities and their sexualities. So putting that in the context, it exacerbates their ACE score, right, from the beginning. But then again, we don't age out of that. So then when we become adults, we then have our trauma experience as adults. So it's compounding trauma experiences that are occurring throughout the lifespan, which is why we wanted to talk about ACEs. So some of the things that can happen, and again, this is not like a permanent thing, like, oh, I experienced, emotional abuse as a child, I'm going to have bronchitis now. That's not what we're saying, but it's important to be aware of some of these lasting impacts and possible risk outcomes that can be associated with trauma experienced in your childhood, right? So again, it suggests the ACE study findings suggest that these experiences are major risk factors, and they are some of the leading causes of illness and death, as well as a poor quality of life, right? So this can include things like injury, right? You're more likely to have traumatic brain injury, fractures, burns, chronic disease, right? Cancer, diabetes, heart disease, emphysema, chronic bronchitis, infectious disease, HIV and STDs, STIs. For mental health, right? Depression, anxiety, suicidality, so suicide attempts, or increased self-harm and self-mutilation behavior, PTSD. In terms of, birthing health, that could be unintended pregnancy, pregnancy complications, fetal death. And then, of course, it can increase those maladaptive coping skills, right? I don't like that it's phrased risky behaviors, because what even is that? But that could be an increase in alcohol use and substance use and practicing in unhealthy and unsafe sexual practice, right? So again, this isn't just directly related to youth. Yes, it happens during our youth, but it's something that carries us across the lifespan. Because if this is experience we had at 8, right, and we're struggling with these things, and then we're going to be struggling at 10, and then 20, and then 40, and 65, right? We're going to carry this through our lifespan. And also why it's important is because folks that suffered from physical neglect and abuse in childhood are more likely to tolerate poor care later in life, right? So it sets up this pattern, right? That brainwave gets rewritten of this is what relationships look like. This is this is normal, normalizing that experience, right? And that can lead to all of these risk factors increasing throughout your lifespan. So we're going to talked about kind of the physical manifestation, right, of like the impact it can have on our health. But what about our brain, right? Michelle talked a lot, not a lot, but Michelle covered the kind of developing brain for children, right? And what that looks like. It's about your experiences that are impacted along with genes. They work together. But we always hear trauma has such a profound impact, it changes your brain. And we're going to talk about how. So when we think about the brain, we're going to think about it in terms of front brain and back brain. And our back brain is what's in charge of our emotions and our reactions. And our front brain is in charge of our focus and attention, right? So in someone that has not experienced trauma, lucky them, right? The front brain or the thalamus receives an emotional stimuli, right? Like something comes in and then it sends it back to the processing part of your brain, which is the cerebral cortex. And then, determines like, okay, what is this? What's going on? Am I in danger? What's happening? And then it sends out a response down to the back brain, the amygdala, for an emotional response to come out, right? And these are things that we do all the time without thinking. However, when somebody experiences trauma, after a trauma, the signals from our back brain, our alpha waves, start to increase in speed and move quickly, which signals danger and agitation, right? It's on that heightened state all the time of like, okay, what's going on? Something's going to happen, right? When that happens, our brain in the front, our beta waves slow down, which makes it harder to pay attention and retain any information, right? And we've seen that. If you've ever been in a heightened state where you're upset, right? Or someone's trying to talk to you, you're not listening because we're agitated, right? Our brain's moving. We're focused on like primal instinct rather than like focus and attention, right? When this happens, your brain becomes primal and it's focusing on survival and instinct rather than understanding and intellect. So now when an emotional stimuli occurs, right, something happens, it completely skips your processing part of your brain and comes right out to the amygdala as an immediate response, an immediate emotional response, right? So my favorite example that we always use is, for example, if you're working with somebody and the person that caused them harm, right, at the time of a trauma that they experienced was wearing a green shirt. And I know Michelle is wearing her green sweater today, and I cannot when that lines up. It's absurd, and I love it. So sorry, Michelle. But so if they're the person that caused them harm was wearing a green shirt, and they come in and meet with you, and you're wearing the same color shirt, I know, right? You are not my abuser. I know you are not. My rational brain would know you're not my abuser. I'm in a safe space with you. But my trauma brain sees that color and thinks back to that trauma, and I can't talk myself down, right? My brain's agitated. I'm automatically going to just be emotional because my brain is now rewritten, right? That's a danger color. That means I'm unsafe, right? This is really important because we can be witnessing trauma reactions from folks, and oftentimes we can see them as like difficult. And while that may be true also, it's important to recognize that we're witnessing trauma responses, right? And how to better work with and understand where the person's coming from. But it also impacts decision-making abilities, right? So this might be where you're seeing emotions aren't matching what you're telling somebody. They're uneasy, aren't able to make up their mind. You're witnessing trauma responses, right? And we're going to talk more about what that looks like in a couple slides. So again, when talking about the brain, one way of understanding trauma and its impact is understanding our physical system, which includes the body, brain, and emotions, that it's wired for survival, right? Our brain is constantly sorting information and making decisions about what is and what is not safe all the time, right? So those pathways, right? It's coming in, going up, coming out all the time. And we don't even think about it, right? It's the brain. It's amazing. Information comes in from our environments and from within ourselves. So this information is not neutral. It's shaped by our past experiences, our current emotional state, as well as our instinct, right? So this process, again, happens outside of our own awareness, and it's automatic, just like breathing, right? We don't really think about it. And our senses send signals that sound the brain's alarm system. So our responses are also automatic, right? We don't think like, okay, my response is going to be, I'm going to smile now, right? It just happens. So sometimes others can easily see our responses, and sometimes they're invisible. And we can be aware or unaware of what is happening, and that awareness can vary depending on the person or their circumstance. So when we talk about what these responses are, typically what we mean is fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Some view freeze is what happens when fight or flight is not possible, right? You literally just freeze, right? I'm done. Like I withdrawn, I'm just going to sit, I'm going to dissociate, I'm freezing, right? There's nothing else I can do. When feeling threatened, it may be extremely difficult to access our capacities and careful thought and planning, right? So freeze is that state. When we talk about fight, that's, fighting back, right? Engaging in the environment with the person, whatever the threat may be. Flight is, I need to be done. I need to walk away. I need to end the conversation. I need to tune out, whatever that looks like in terms of flight. And one that folks, that may be newer to folks is called fawning. Fawning is where you essentially are going along with your environment to maintain your safety. We see this a lot when we're talking about survivors, right? Because they know how to keep themselves safe. So like constantly, some typical ways this can show up is like constantly apologizing, going along with what's being asked, even if it's not necessarily consensual, in order to maintain safety, in order to maintain their brain not being activated, in order to stay engaged in the environment, right? It's a really important one. A lot of folks, it's kind of split in the conversation, whether this is unintentional or not, that this is something people choose to do, and it is not, right? If you're engaged in active gaslighting and emotional abuse or physical, like any type of, violence fueled environment, fawning is something your brain's going to automatically do to keep yourself safe, right? Because when we're talking about trauma and being in trauma experiences, remember, we're in primal brain, we're in survival brain. I don't have time to think through all of this. My brain's going to tell me to do what I need to do in the moment to maintain safety, right? To keep it self-regulated. So fawn is absolutely one of those automatic responses. The thing about these alarm systems, right, because they're essentially alarm systems in our brain, they can remain long after the current threat has passed. So telling someone, reassuring someone like you're safe, right, may not turn off the state of alarm. And when we can't return to our baseline and that alarm is constantly on, we may be expecting and preparing for danger at every turn, right? That's hypervigilance of like constantly being on edge, like something's going to happen, always looking over your shoulder, being very jumpy, very clammy, all of those types of things, right? With actual safety and learning, we can increase our awareness about our responses and learn to respond differently. However, in the context of domestic violence, the threat of physical and emotional safety may be present and ongoing. So it makes sense that fear, thoughts, and reminders of violence and trauma may make emotions difficult to regulate, right? So trauma, especially chronic and ongoing abuse, violence, and oppression, brings about changes to our survival system, right? It's literally rewriting our brains. We become more tuned in to possible danger, which can be life-saving, right? Our systems, though, however, aren't built to be on like that. We're not meant to constantly be on edge and like all the time. That's not how we're built. So we develop ways to cope and adapt when that happens. Some of the ways people cope are often misunderstood or seen as harmful or uncooperative or risky. And honestly, the biggest one we see with this is substance use, right? There's such a stigma around that, but what it is coping with a trauma at its baseline. That's what substance use is, right? And in our work, right, as victim service providers, it can be challenging to remain compassionate and empathetic with folks, right? When we're experiencing this, when we're witnessing this, we're interpreting it as like self-destructive behavior. They're not taking things seriously, whatever may come out, which is also a sign of secondary trauma and burnout, which we're going to talk about more. But it's important to name that, right? And that's okay. But the fact that we can name it and then learn and do better is really important too. So we are going to watch a video. I'm going to try to play it from here and see if it works. It may not, it may, we'll see.
So during a traumatic situation, there are two basic neurobiological processes that we're interested in looking at. One is what hormones are released and how does that affect behavior during the assault and the immediate aftermath of the assault. And then what is happening with respect to the memory of that traumatic event. Most survivors are going to have one of four main stress chemicals released in their bodies, or some have multiple hormones and chemicals released at the time of the assault. One of which are going to be the catecholamines. Catecholamines are like natural adrenaline. It's what pumps your body up in a traumatic or stressful situation that would help a survivor be able to fight back against the attacker or try to flee from the situation. Another hormone that's often released for survivors during an assault are the corticosteroids. And those work in conjunction with the catecholamines to determine how much energy is available. So again, for some survivors, they have a lot of energy available to fight back and to flee, and they stay very pumped up after the assault. But some don't. It sort of bottoms out and flattens out on them, and they might freeze during the assault, or they might be in kind of a stupor almost after the assault. Other hormones that affect the behavior at the time of the assault are opiates, which is like natural morphine. So some survivors during the assault report feeling like they're almost drugged, that they're out of it. And then when they do first responder interviews later, they have no affect. They're just describing it with no emotion, no affect, like they're reading out of the TV guide. There's just nothing to them. That's the opiates. The opiates help block physical pain, which you need during a traumatic situation, but they also just keep blunting everything. Okay. The other hormone that's sometimes released is oxytocin. And this is a hormone that promotes good feelings. Okay, and that may sound strange. Why would you have a hormone that's about good feelings released during a sexual assault? Again, it's about trying to block the pain, the physical pain, the psychological pain. So the body will release opiates, natural morphine, to try to tamp down the physical pain. And sometimes it will release oxytocin in conjunction with that to try to balance it out. Hormone that promotes good feelings, hormone that tries to blunt pain. Again, it's just trying to mitigate the pain of this assault. But if the oxytocin levels get a little high, sometimes survivors might laugh, giggle, smile, engage in socially appropriate behavior that's socially inappropriate given that situation. So those are the four hormones that can affect the behavior during the assault. And these hormones are really instrumental in blocking the physical pain, helping the body react to the trauma of the assault. Now here's the kicker. Those four hormones, very helpful in so many ways. When those four hormone levels are very high in the body, it interferes with other structures in your brain that are trying to lay down the neural mechanisms of the memory. So it's one of those times where our body's kind of working at cross purposes. Those hormones are really helpful for fight, for flight, for mitigating the pain, but they cause cellular damage in two key structures of our brain that work to lay down a memory. What we've learned from the neurobiology of trauma research is that the memories of traumatic events are stored in a very disorganized way. When a survivor sits down and tries to explain to either a responding officer or detective what happened in the assault, and it starts coming out in this bits and pieces fragmented way of they start one thing, but then they stop abruptly and then they start talking about something else, or they start explaining it very generally and then they start throwing in random details, it can be very confusing for law enforcement. And a lot of law enforcement, based on other training they've had, will look at that and say, this looks suspicious to me because it seems like they're making it up as they're going along. They're not making it up as they're going along. They're having difficulty recalling the different pieces of the assault because of the way the trauma of the assault affected the way the memory is laid down. So for law enforcement, they see this completely disorganized, discombobulated presentation and they say, I'm not believing this. This seems made up to me. What they're really seeing is evidence of trauma. What they're really seeing is how trauma impacts memory formation and then memory recall. So I think it's important for law enforcement to keep in mind that when they see that really confusing stop, start, disorganized presentation, to think about that what they're seeing is trauma. What they're seeing is a survivor trying to reach into the different pieces and parts of their brain and all the different fragments of that memory, and they're doing their best to put it together and to give it back. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that the research is very clear that the accuracy of the memory is intact. So even though the storage is fragmented, and can come out kind of sounding confusing and in bits and pieces, the actual recall, accurate. One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things, okay? Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up, and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk, because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual, obviously misfiled. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessa, for sharing that video. We just really love the way that that articulates pretty much everything that we've been talking about for the first portion of this presentation. There really is so much going on with trauma and, you know, the physiological response, not just, oh, I experienced this thing and I can't stop thinking about it. It's really, really so much more than that. Before we move on, I just want to, I know a few folks had asked for the link to that video on the chat. So we will provide that link later on once we can both view the chat effectively, because we're multitasking right now. But if for some reason you're not able to stick around for that long or you miss the link, we'll also be sharing our contact information at the end, and you can reach out to Jessa or myself for any of the resources that we share today. So thank you so much. And thanks for the positive feedback. We really love that video and the way that it really explains not just how trauma impacts the brain, but specific to survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, how we can better understand the process of support, you know, while they are, for example, having to, you know, talk to law enforcement, healthcare staff, even to us as advocates. So we've already learned a lot about how stress and trauma sort of impact the brain, how it changes those neural pathways, you know, how this can have an impact from childhood all the way through the lifespan. Now, we wanted to take just a little bit of time to talk about what does that actually really look like? And for most of you who are working in direct service, you've already seen this, right? You've already been able to really see the impact of trauma, but we don't always think about certain things as a trauma response. So we're used to the sort of big picture, you know, like Jessa mentioned, the green shirt, which, like, maybe I wore this green shirt on purpose for the purposes of demonstrating this metaphor. Maybe I didn't. We'll never know. But those are the sort of trauma responses that I think we're all pretty prepared for, air quotes, right? We're prepared for the idea of something activating trauma. We're prepared for working with somebody who's having, you know, post-traumatic stress symptoms and things like that. But sometimes we're not as prepared or even aware of the everyday ways that trauma impacts, you know, survivors. So things like undiagnosed physical pain, even things like autoimmune diseases, you know, or compromised immune systems, those ongoing, you know, issues that can, that can almost seem frustrating. Like, I've gone to the doctor doesn't know what's wrong. My back hurts constantly. They say that it's nothing wrong. If you have the luxury of being able to get x-rays, if you have the luxury of even being able to go to multiple doctor appointments, compromised immune system means, folks that just are always sort of catching whatever's going around. And if you are working in a communal, a residential environment, this one probably seems pretty common to you. And as folks who work there, you may also be the person that is like, man, every time something's going around, I just seem to catch it, no matter what. There's also things like migraines, cluster headaches, the survivors that are just always like, man, can I get another Tylenol? Can I, I just can't seem to get rid of this headache, I'm constantly just feeling that pressure. And then there's, as Jessa had mentioned earlier, the mental health impact of trauma. So it's not just, the direct impact. I had a trauma activator, I'm having a flashback or a memory. It's also ongoing mental health, depression, anxiety, and sometimes, exacerbated mental health because of misdiagnosis for other things. So we oftentimes are pretty quick to say PTSD, even if there's not a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, but we sometimes don't think about some of the other things that may be impacting someone, like perhaps an undiagnosed traumatic brain injury or other undiagnosed mental health issues that we're sort of medicating without really looking at the root cause of, which is often trauma. And we know that medications will sometimes, not really play well together. So for example, if there's an undiagnosed brain injury and someone is taking medication for depression or anxiety, that can actually exacerbate symptoms to the point that they are misdiagnosed with a completely unrelated mental health diagnosis like bipolar disorder, or something else. So, that is a significant factor with regard to how trauma actually manifests in an individual. And then there's sleep issues as well. So, sometimes not being able to sleep, sometimes sleeping all the time. And these are sometimes easy to hide in a residential environment specifically. We expect that folks are going to be tired when they come in after experiencing a traumatic situation, but we may not realize that, not being able to get out of bed before a certain amount of time or getting so much sleep and still being exhausted is more than just somebody that, in the moment is experiencing a trauma response, but an ongoing response to ongoing trauma. And then there's things like, increased screen time. So I can say, during the first portion of the pandemic, I don't tend to play a lot of games on my phone, but for some reason I was like, man, Candy Crush is all I want to do with my life forever. I didn't really even recognize, and Jess and I train about this all the time. It didn't even really dawn on me that that was a stress response. I was just like, for some reason, the only thing I want to do is be on my phone and not really think about anything that's going on in the world. There's disassociation, there's increased or decreased food intake. These are also things to be aware of that are trauma responses or can be trauma responses. It's not just somebody that is mindfully checking out. It is something that happens, as a response to trauma. So when we look at sort of the Venn diagram of what trauma responses are or what they look like or how they manifest, there's three general categories that we can look at. Now, obviously this isn't exhaustive, but we can sort of place this into, that first little circle is that impaired filtering system. So what we know is that when somebody has experienced trauma, especially when it tips into that toxic, ongoing trauma experience, their ability to respond in a what we would consider to be like appropriate way is often disrupted, and that is because of all of those neural pathways, as Jessa explained earlier, they're not going through that, oh, I'm categorizing this in an appropriate way and I can access it in a way that makes sense. It's pure emotion. And so that filtering system becomes impaired. There may be a feeling of danger when none exists. So the green shirt, if you see that color, you may not even realize that what's going on is a stress response. All of a sudden, you may just be like, you know what, I'm in a real bad mood and I don't feel like talking to this person right now. And I don't even know why, but I am going to be really grumpy and I am going to storm out of here, or I'm going to feel scared, even though there's really no reason, for me to be feeling that way. That filtering system that says that's cool, that's not cool, that's safe, that isn't, is not giving accurate feedback. So the next thing that can happen is just a disconnect between cognition, right? Our thinking part of the brain that can categorize things in that encyclopedic way, and our emotion, which is that amygdala, that emotional response. There's not a good connection between the two of them. So feelings and emotions may no longer fit the situation. Anger is expressed when other people are feeling happy. So somebody says, oh, I finally got into housing. And the response, is not, oh, I'm sharing in your happiness. It's anger. It's, I feel, rage about this thing because of that disrupted brain connection. Feelings of joy are sometimes dulled by feelings of pain and heartache. It's almost like all of those feelings are just waiting for a way to come out. And when we have an experience of joy, guess what? All of those other feelings are coming out too, because there is not a good way to categorize them. When feelings of pain and heartache increase, independent coping skills decrease. So the expansion of, as Jessa had talked about earlier, those maladaptive coping skills. So feelings of pain and heartache increase. Maybe you're doing really well, and then all of a sudden you have a trauma activator, and suddenly the coping skills that you've developed are like out the window. And now I'm going to play Candy Crush for 12 hours straight and not really engage in the process because I'm going right back to where I was before. And then the other factor to think about is unaddressed trauma. Oftentimes this is stuff that occurs in, early childhood years, as we talked about before, those ACEs. And this is where that can really come up. So if there were maladaptive coping skills that were developed in childhood, those are part of those neural pathways that are that, dirt pathway through a green grass field, right? They're in there. And they're very difficult to not take, especially when we're dealing with these other two things, impaired filtering system and disconnection between emotion and cognition. Those shortcuts are going to be a whole lot easier to take. And so we're going to fall back into maladaptive coping skills. We may have poor mental and physical health, a continual state of fight or flight, just really not being able to determine, anymore what is a safe environment and what is not. That constant sense of hyper vigilance, that always like, oh, I'm just always going to be prepared for something to happen because I can't trust my ability to perceive if something is safe or not. So I'm just going to assume that everything is unsafe, because that is what a coping skill does. It keeps us safe. The also feeling of having to choose between needs. So instead of, having that basic understanding that, all of my needs will be met. If you had to choose those needs in childhood, well, I can either, eat, or I can hide in my room and not have to worry about getting in trouble for looking for food. There's not a way to make sure that all of those needs are being met. That can come up again if that trauma hasn't been addressed. And so generally we just have, when there's unaddressed trauma, a sense that there is no safety to be had. And obviously these are just some examples of what trauma might look like, but we can see how this can manifest in survivors of trauma that we're trying to offer support for. And as Jessa said earlier, sometimes this may come up as folks who, get that label of difficult. Well, I've tried to work with this person and they just will not open up to me. Or they're always so concerned about, trying to get their back pain to stop that they're not being able to focus on what we're actually working on. As Jessa also mentioned, sometimes people are difficult to work with, and that's fine. Like, everyone is different, but it's very important for us to be able to identify that much of those behaviors is rooted in trauma in some way. And so, like, a good way to think about this is like the layers of an onion, right? Because when we're looking at working with individuals who have experienced trauma, and also, by the way, which we'll get into next, our own experiences of trauma, there's all of these things that we bring to the table. It's not just what somebody walks through the door with. And very often for all of us in the advocacy world, no matter what our role is, we're working with someone who's presenting a trauma. I am coming to you for help and support because I'm in an abusive relationship. I'm coming here because I experienced a sexual assault and I need help, right? That's the presenting trauma, and often what we focus on. But we need to remember that that individual has layers. They have a trauma history, right? All of us have experienced some form of trauma. Now, it may not be, the same kinds of things, but if you're having a bad day, not being able to find your car keys can count as a kind of trauma. If you're running late, if you're supposed to be somewhere, if you can't find your keys, all of a sudden, all of the other times that you've experienced that comes into play. Those neural pathways that have been made through all of those other experiences of different kinds of stress in childhood are going to come up. And then there's co-occurring trauma. So I don't know about all of you, but in my own life and in working with survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, it's not just, I experienced this one thing and that's the only thing that's going on, right? It's very, very frequently, I experienced this one thing. In addition to that, I have these 5 other things that I'm trying to figure out how to deal with at the same time. So we are, in essence, we may be providing services to individuals that have presenting trauma history, and co-occurring trauma all at the same time. And it's really important for us to remember that, because we can get a little in the weeds and we're like, look, I solved this presenting trauma. I have, provided the thing that a person has come here and asked me for. For some reason, they are still stressed out and not really able to engage in the process. Why could that be? This is an example of why that might be, and the things that we have to remember. Another thing that we really like to talk about is multi-abuse trauma. So this is a lovely graphic that I credit Jessa with creating, because they are amazing. This I had tacked up in my office because it is a really great reminder of what an individual is oftentimes walking around with. It's interpersonal violence, potentially child abuse, coexisting conditions, which we just talked about. And then there's things like systemic and societal oppression, generational trauma, coping abuse, and ongoing trauma, right? Because just because we are dealing with trauma in the moment doesn't mean that it's not potentially going to be ongoing, that there aren't going to be other things that come up. So this is just a reminder of when we talk about trauma, which is sort of the whole beginning part of this presentation, this is what we're talking about, this very individual, very unique aspect of a person who is walking through your door asking for help, and for us to not make assumptions about what that might look like. This is also really important for us to remember as service providers, and that is what we're going to be talking about next. So I'm going to hand things over to Jessa to talk a little bit more about, now that we know what trauma is, what does it have to do with me, you might be asking. Well, we're so glad you asked.
So not only may you have experienced trauma through your childhood into your adulthood, right? Working in the work we work in, work, is also a form of trauma. It is called secondary trauma, and we're going to talk about it because our field has not done enough when in talking about this concept and understanding it. So I'm really excited and looking forward to talking about this with you today. So we're going to play a game. And I want you to think in your head of what comes to mind. It's a word association game. So you're going to see a word, I'm going to say it, and I want you to picture it in your head. If you want to put it into the chat, that's fine. I can't see the chat, so I don't get to see the fun, but I want you to think, when I say cow, what do you think of? Some people may think of a cow. Oftentimes folks think of milk. Some of you may think of this, which is fine. I'm going to do another one. So when we think about work, right? What comes to mind when you hear the word or see the word work? Some of you may love this, right? Like, I love my job, and that's the first reaction. We are not in this field for the money, so we may think that. Some of us may feel like this, watching the clock every day. But how many of you thought of an image like this, right? Of like frustration and overwhelm. Now, when we think of like trauma, right? When I say the word trauma, or when I say specifically like PTSD, a trauma experience, what comes to your head? Right? We're in a global pandemic. We've seen frontline workers and what that looks like. Some folks may think firefighters, right? Public facing service. But what about us? What about victim service providers, right? How many of you thought that? Like my own job, right? Well, we need to, because we experience secondary trauma. Secondary trauma occurs when the impact of others' life experiences with trauma also impact ours. So when we're opening our hearts and our minds, right? When we bear witness, right, to the gift that survivors, that the folks we're working with are sharing of their experiences with us, right? When we're willing to know and create that emotional safety for people to share their lived experiences, we're impacted, we are affected, right? So in victim service work, right, we're open to being with folks while they heal, right? While they explore themselves and their resources and heal. Being open with such compassion and empathy also opens us up to others' pain where we can be deeply impacted. Secondary trauma has been defined as the transformation in an advocate's inner experience as a result of their responsibility to and empathetic engagement with other people who have experienced abuse, violence, or discrimination of any type. So another way to view this is as the, like cumulative inner transformative effect of bearing witness to abuse, violence, and trauma in the lives of people that we're open to. When we allow ourselves to be open and attuned, open to other people's experiences, or to partner with others, we're also affected. It's essentially like emotional residue that sticks with us, right? It's a common occurrence for folks that work in our field, right? Anyone that holds any sort of support, helping, or advocacy role has this. Secondary trauma can affect advocates in deep and enduring ways, which can create distance between advocates and the folks they're working with. And it can lead to advocates behaving in ways that don't line up with how they intend to be. And we're going to really unpack that and look at what this looks like, but also talk about how to recognize and transform it, right? So this isn't a downer conversation of like, look how traumatized we are, nothing to do about it, right? It's important we understand what those feelings are, why we aren't aligning with who we thought we would be, right? Why we can't stop thinking about that client that I saw 8 years ago, and I can't stop wondering where they're at, or if I said the right thing to them, or if I did enough for them, right? Though that's secondary trauma, and that's also stress and burnout that's coming to light together. So when we talk about secondary trauma, it is, again, it's a common effect of folks that work in victim services work, and it impacts your worldview, right? You start to see the world differently, right? You're viewing people differently. You're seeing, the true human nature of what people look like, what systems look like, right? Where we get more cynical, right? And that's a sign of burnout. But it impacts our worldview and understanding of the world, right? It can also diminish our hope and our optimism, which are essential gifts that we bring to our work, right? That's like a key element of who we are as advocates, is being hopeful, right? And optimistic of like, okay, if A to Z doesn't work plan wise, we'll start all over again. We will get it figured out. And like, that's a true thing that advocates do, right? It's not a one and done type of engagement. And it can diminish that over time, right? We're engaging in systems that are harmful. We're not seeing the results that survivors are hoping for. The folks that we're working with are constantly meeting roadblocks. All of those things can get in our way. Our own ego getting in our way of our work. All of these things can add to that, right? And one of the most important factors in the success or failure of doing this work is the attention paid to the experience and needs of us, right? And addressing this is addressing secondary trauma, or secondary trauma, stress and burnout, and self-care are an ethical imperative to doing our work. And like I said, our field hasn't really talked much about this before. So it can feel like a newer concept to understand, but it's really important because, again, it names these things that we weren't sure. Like, am I a bad advocate because I feel this way? No, that's secondary trauma and burnout. So I'm going to give it back to Michelle.
So really quickly, we just wanted to kind of, oh, sorry, cat. We just wanted to talk about, when we talk about stress and burnout, what do we mean? Because we use these terms a lot in our work, but it's really important for us to know that, burnout is a state of physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion caused by long involvement in emotionally demanding situations with inadequate support and supervision. That doesn't sound familiar to you. The individual's frustration is with the organizational climate and culture, although this may not be recognized by the individual or organization's leadership. Frustration may also be with existing political and economic structures, creating an overwhelming feeling that the situation won't change. So, common themes include I'm doing too much, there's not enough resources to do the work, not enough money, not enough administrative support. So another term that's often associated with burnout is compassion fatigue. But generally speaking, there's a difference between feeling unable to work with one person right now, which is that compassion fatigue, and feeling unable to do this work anymore, which is burnout. So it's really important to know that, you don't start at burnout, right? You don't like walk through the door on your first day of being an advocate and you're like, oh, I'm so burned out, right? It's cumulative over time. And it starts with that everyday stress and, all of the things that, once again, we saw that what we walk through the door with. So as a person, when we show up for this work, we also have that trauma history. And then we have the things that we see and the things that we hear and the fact that, there may not be a lot of support available for us. And you tack on to that, yeah, we don't do this for the money. And, in the chat, I saw, for a lot of folks, there's this dichotomy of when we think about our work, there's helping and there's, compassion, but then there's also tiredness and exhaustion and capitalism. And, big ups to whoever put that in the chat, because yes, like sometimes it just really seems like, why are we doing all of this work? We can get lost in the stress. And when we start to get lost in the stress, that's what leads us to that burnout, which has really significant impacts on us and our ability to show up, not just for the work, but for ourselves and our lives as well. So, really quickly, the signs and symptoms of burnout and secondary trauma are pretty similar to the signs and symptoms that we talked about before with regard to the trauma that, survivors often walk around with. But there's also some things to bear in mind that, for adults and folks in this work, there's interpersonal impacts. So changes in our relationships with colleagues, withdrawal and isolation, impatience and avoidance of working with clients with certain kinds of trauma histories, lack of collaboration and communication in general. Also, from a behavioral standpoint, just irritability and exhaustion, talking to oneself, and not in the fun, cute way like I do, but like in the like, really not feeling like you're able to connect with anybody else. Frequent tardiness, absenteeism, job changes, and rejecting physical and emotional closeness going out of the way to avoid being alone. And, Jess and I speak to this from experience. Part of the reason why the two of us are so passionate about talking about this is that we both experienced pretty severe burnout from doing work as advocates. And so, when I talk about these symptoms, this isn't just a list that I'm going down. These are things that I remember experiencing myself and didn't realize it in the moment. It didn't dawn on me that like, hey, I'm not the type of person that likes to work with my door closed, but all of a sudden I'm keeping people out because if I talk too much, I'm going to start crying. And that's not an option for me. Job performance, obviously there's lack of motivation and flexibility and, increased errors, avoidance, all of these things that, I think come up for us, maybe not at a burnout level, but I think we all get to that point where we're starting to just notice that we're not as connected to the work as we were when we first started. We can also start to question our values and beliefs, our identity, our worldview, things like that start to get disrupted when we're in this work for too long. I don't know how many other folks out there are like me, but I can remember getting to a certain point in this work where all of a sudden, if like a friend of mine started dating someone, I would be like, nope, they're probably going to be terrible to you, because I just automatically made an assumption that everyone is a potential abuser. And I wasn't able, my whole worldview changed. So it's important to know that all of these things, your personal beliefs, values, things like that, can have an impact on our potential for the amount of time it can take for us to experience secondary trauma. Some factors will serve as buffers. Others may shorten what time it takes for us to experience, the mitigating factors that we try to introduce. So just like we had talked about with regard to trauma, it's different for everyone. It's also different with regard to secondary trauma and how we experience it and how we start to buffer it and come back from it. It's a really complex process, and that self-awareness that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation is one of the best ways that we can start to figure out how to best heal. So when we talk about transforming secondary trauma, awareness, connection, and balance are the things that we try to promote. So awareness is being attuned to your needs, to your limits, to your emotions, and to your resources. To heed all sources of information. So the cognitive information that you get, the physical information that you get, and the intuitive information that you get. So when we talk about creating that balance, for example, some of you, when we said self-care, were like, ugh, I don't want to do 20 minutes of meditation, because you had an instant cognitive reaction of, I know what self-care is and I don't like it. And that physical and intuitive response of, somebody made me engage in self-care in a way that didn't make me feel comfortable before, and now that's my reaction. Being aware of that is a really good step towards finding what actually will work. And then practicing that mindfulness and awareness to really, be able to connect with what works for you as an individual. Balance means, balancing work, play, and rest, which is really challenging to do in the majority of advocacy roles, right? But it's very important to figure out how to have that balance. And connections. So connection to yourself, to other people, and to something bigger, whether it's the movement, whether it's spiritual connection, whatever it is that you can connect to that can give you that ability to kind of, check out and to do things that are meaningful. So the take home point here is that who you are really matters. Be aware of things like shame when talking about these issues. Be aware of not wanting to bother about it. Be aware of starting to compare yourself to others and that contributing to that sense of stress and burnout. And this is the time when integrating self-care can start. Because once you start to engage in that self-awareness, you can then start to figure out what actually works for you. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like, and then offer some suggestions, and meaningful ones, not just, hey, do that 20 minutes of meditation and you're good to go, but how to actually integrate self-care into your work.
Cool. So this is one of my favorite slides when we talk about secondary trauma. So vicarious secondary trauma is like, to advocates, is like a sunburn to a lifeguard. It's going to happen, right? It's all about preparing for it. So whenever we are engaging in self-care, meaning like meaningful self-care, right? It's acting like sunscreen, where it's preventative. It's preventing that burn, right? It's going to help create that barrier between the harm and yourself. Whenever we don't have, it lessens the impact. But whenever we're ignoring self-care or doing minimal self-care, where we do like one grand gesture for ourselves, like, okay, I took a yoga class 3 months ago, that's good, right? Or, I participated in our office-wide breathing moment together, that's self-care, right? Whenever we neglect that, it acts like aloe vera. Aloe vera after the sunburn is fine, but it's not a solution, and it's certainly not a long-term solution, right? So what's really important about this is to anticipate it's going to happen, right? We are steeped in trauma in our field. That is what we do, right? We also carry our own lived experiences to anticipate that this is going to happen. It's really important also to build self-awareness, right? To understand your own traumas, your own experiences, where you are with things, what your activators are, right? Learning about yourself. And then creating a meaningful self-care plan, right? Which is what we're going to do together, and talking about what that can look like. And when we're talking about creating self-care plans, right? We're not talking about just getting through the day. We're talking about when you get to that point where you're literally like crawling out of bed, forcing yourself to get out of bed, right? To like force yourself to do things where you're not feeling yourself, where you're not eating, you're not feeling it anymore, right? Where you're questioning, is this really what I want to do? What do I actually contribute to this work, right? What even am I talking about half the time? Because I live in that world of like, what even am I? Who am I? What am I doing here, right? So this isn't a knock on things like bubble baths or pedicures or go shopping, right? But those are, classes. They're not always accessible. They're also not long-term things. We're talking about a call to action for some really serious self-reflection and self-awareness for self-care. And we mean self-care, we're talking about sometimes basics, changing your socks, right? Taking your medicines, basic stuff that's important. So now we're going to move into self-care. I think we have a poll. So if you want to go to the little side part of your bar, it's going to come up. It'll say poll if you click it, and it's going to ask, what do you do for self? Do you have a self-care plan? So if you all want to take that, Michelle, I can't see it. So if you want to let me know what happens.
Absolutely. Okay, so it looks like we're sort of right in between. Yes, I use it regularly, and yes, but I don't use it ever, which I 100% relatable. And then a few folks too that do not. So right now the slight majority is yes, and I use it regularly, which is awesome, and that's about 45%. 30% have one but don't use it ever, which once again, like same. And then 23% do not have a self-care plan.
Awesome.
And thanks to everybody for participating in that.
Yes.
We're very excited about this poll. It was like, it's all new technology for us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to hear that some of you do have one. For folks that do not, or even folks that already do, right? Maybe we're going to talk about something new that you can integrate that may be effective for you. So stay tuned.
So as I've mentioned several times, even hearing the word self-care plan for a long time, like, was an activator for me, just because I had reached a level of burnout that was pretty toxic, and the self-care that was available to me at that time was just not effective. Sitting quietly for 5 minutes by myself was like the worst thing in the world. So when we talk about self-care, I think it's really important, if other folks have had that kind of experience before, to use that self-awareness to shift into what self-care actually should be or actually looks like. And we can look at it in 3 different ways. And the most important one that I think is most frequently overlooked is basic self-care. So this is things like changing your clothes, right? This is things like drinking fluids, whatever feels best. Doesn't have to be water, just something liquid that can help you get hydrated. Showering and bathing regularly, and making that self-care, because a lot of times it's like, ugh, I have to take a shower now, not setting those parameters of making it a chore, but turning that into, I'm going to engage in self-care, which I deserve, and I'm going to take a shower today. And if I'm 5 minutes late for something, that's okay, because I'm engaging in basic self-care right now and it's important. Taking your medication and vitamins, getting enough sleep, or taking a nap if you need to. And developing a routine around basic self-care as a form of prevention. And I think that a lot of times we get mired in the bubble baths and pedicures part of self-care, but a basic self-care routine doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be glamorous. I talk about water all the time. I bought myself a fancy water bottle because drinking water for me is a form of self-care. If I'm having the busiest day ever, I can take 2 seconds, get my fancy water bottle and take a sip of water. And that is self-care. And it's a moment that I took for myself. At work, this can look like just having a work setting that's comfortable. It can be setting break times or using break times, because a lot of us have them, but we don't always use them, and being really flexible about that. Adjusting our expectations as needed and reprioritizing things as you can. So really, we have this pride in overwork culture. And I think fundamentally in the advocacy world in particular, if you're not burned out and skipping lunch, are you even an advocate? So Jess and I are here to say yes, and let's just stop it. And let's stop with this idea of thinking that by being overworked, we're somehow, presenting this idea of being the perfect advocate. Advocates need rest. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to take breaks, and we need to not overwork ourselves to the point that we aren't functional. It also looks like things like supervisor check-ins and setting boundaries, not having to share everything about yourself with your coworkers, with your clients, and developing a boundary statement with yourself. Outside of work, there's a need to have an outside of work, okay? So like, first and foremost, if work and home are bleeding into one another, find ways for that to be, to have a boundary there, so that even if you are working from home, there's a set boundary between work and when you're not at work anymore. Also, give yourself permission to set boundaries around the types of communications that you have with people that you talk to, meaning you don't have to answer an email that comes in at 8 p.m. You can set a very strong boundary with your coworkers that once I'm done work for the day, I'm not answering any emails. And they may be like, yeah, duh, if I send you something at 8 p.m., I don't expect a response, but setting that boundary for yourself. These are just some examples of the ways that this can look. One of the things that Jessa and I have been talking about a lot throughout this last couple of years are COVID-19 principles, because work has changed a lot and self-care has changed a lot for us. And so some things to remember as well, for those of you that have had the opportunity to work from home, or, especially, if there is another time period where we're not able to work in person, to remember that it's not a privilege. It's not like, oh, I get to work from home. You're working from home during a crisis situation, and to be really mindful of that. To also remember that your personal, physical, mental, and emotional health is way more important than anything else during a pandemic and otherwise. So prioritizing yourself has never been more important than it is right now, but should always be important. You should also try not to compensate for perceived lost productivity by working longer hours, right? During a crisis situation, you have to care for yourself first, and there may be an unspoken expectation, whether it's your own or within your organization, that you need to make up for extra time. No, there is no reason to burn yourself out, especially during a crisis situation, whether it's COVID-19 or another situation that requires you to put extra effort in at work. Being able to set a boundary is really important to prioritize yourself. You'll be kind to yourself and not judge how you are coping based on how you see other folks coping. And this comes up a lot, whether it's COVID-19 or otherwise. You may take a look at someone and be like, oh, they always make time to take an extra, 15 minutes at lunch. That's fine. That works for them. If that's not what works for you, it's not healthy to compare. Figure out what works for yourself. You'll also be kind to others and not judge how they're coping based on how you're coping. So if somebody really likes to eat, 2 bags of Fritos to cope and that's their reward, that's fine. You don't have to do it, but let's not judge other folks for how they're coping during a crisis or otherwise. And finally, remember that you and your team's success will not be judged the same way it was when things were quote unquote normal. So really being able to be flexible with our expectations. And once again, during COVID-19, this has been really important, but moving forward, it's really important for us to readjust how we perceive success and normalcy. And remembering that, we're in this work to help. We're in this work to make a difference, and we shouldn't be setting such a high bar for what that might look like, right? Being able to show up and do this work the best of our abilities and prioritizing ourselves is the most important thing. So this is something that Jessa and I love, which is the self-care wheel, because in our work, we love a wheel, but this one is an opportunity to really use that wheel to an advantage and look at all of the different ways that we can engage in self-care. And this can look a bit overwhelming, right? Oh, I got to worry about psychological self-care and emotional self-care and physical self-care. No, you do not. The great thing about the self-care wheel is that you can pick one thing. And this can be flexible. You can take a look and say, you know what, right now, I don't really feel up for physical self-care, but I could deal with some emotional self-care, and look at that list and say, oh, there's one thing on there that I might be able to do that works for me. Whether it's, reading a book, whether it's talking to a friend, whether it's, sitting by yourself for a few minutes. The idea here is that this isn't self-care that's imposed on you. This is self-care that you develop for yourself. And we even have a blank version of this so that you can fill in your own stuff, because the stuff that's pre-filled is great suggestions, but we also encourage you to take a look and decide for yourself what fits into those different categories. So I'm going to turn things over to Jessa to take us home, because there's some other resources that we also think are pretty great. And then we want to have some time to talk with all of you.
Yeah, so I know we're coming close to time, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but creating self-care kits is also one of my favorite things. One of my other coworkers and I talk about ours all the time. We meet regularly in person because we live in Greensburg together, which is exciting. But this is something that you can do with clients, right? With folks you're working with, or for yourself. And all it is something that you can see, right? So whether you pick a color for the day, today my color is green. I'm going to look at everything green in the room that I'm in. For me, it's my favorite little printout, which I know is probably not good, but it says, I do not have any pronouns. Do not refer to me ever. It's a little teddy bear that's like screaming. He is my favorite. This is my sight thing in my visual space that keeps me grounded. For sound, it's your walk-up song, right? If you walked in a room, what would play? So that's what you're humming in your head. For smell, having things like oils, hand sanitizers that are appealing to you, putting it inside your mask. For touch, if you have anything sensory that you can touch. And then taste, right? Always having some sort of like liquid or candy or something near you. Again, you can put these in a little bag, have it in your environment where it's spaced out, and plan for yourself as well as somebody else. And then there's also this really great resource called Everything is Awful and I'm Not Okay, which I will drop in the chat. Also, there's a check-in quiz that talks about basic self-care. So I will drop all of that in the chat. Here's our information, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anyone has any questions or would like anything else, because I know we're at the end.
And I want to acknowledge we're getting a lot of love in the chat for self-care kits and and the self-care wheel. So thank you everybody for your boosting of these resources. I know that this seems simple, so that's the point. And I think the thing that Jessa and I have realized in our own, kind of self-care and burnout recovery journey is that, we often have this preconceived notion that self-care needs to be something really elaborate. Turns out it doesn't. It can be something really simple, and engaging in mindful self-awareness is really the biggest factor. So we'll be dropping the self-care wheel and these other, other things into the chat. And I'm keeping an eye on Q&A. I'm not seeing any questions in there as well. We encourage you to reach out to us with any further questions. We have tons of resources. Most importantly, we encourage you to take care of yourselves. That's the most important thing, because you're the most valuable aspect of this work. And if you're not taking care of yourself, there's no way that we can take care of other people.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for all the love in the chat. This is great.